Good evening. Welcome to the August 14th, 2013 meeting of the City of Lake Forest Plan Commission. I am Michael Lay, Chairman of the Commission, and at this time I'd like to introduce the members of the Commission. To my far right is Commissioner Anderson and Commissioner Culbertson. To my far left, Commissioner Kuchman and Commissioner Ziccarelli. From city staff, Kathy Zerniak from the Department of Community Development is here tonight, and we will proceed with our agenda. Our first item is approval of our meeting minutes. They're not quite finished from the last meeting, so we will set those aside, approval of any minutes, and we'll probably have them at our next meeting for, get them prior to the meeting and have them considered and approved and amended, whatever. The only item of substance on our agenda tonight is item number 3, discussion, public comment, and recommendations on the Laurel Avenue property. At this time, I would ask whether or not there's any member of the commission have had any ex parte contacts or current conflicts of interest on this matter.
No.
Seeing none, we'll proceed. I would just like to emphasize that the Laurel Avenue property development guidelines are here before us. And I want to emphasize that there is no site plan and no specific redevelopment plan before us tonight. Although I expect the commission to consider, debate, and probably forward a recommendation on these guidelines to the City Council, we won't be taking any formal action to recommend approval of any specific project. At this time, no developer has been yet selected. What we are here charged to do tonight is to make a recommendation to the City Council on those development parameters or guidelines that strike the right balance between setting out the city's expectation for the site while allowing and encouraging developer expertise and activity. So to proceed with this matter, I'd like to ask the city's consultant, Lee Brown, to come forward and to summarize the commission's discussions and comments to date, and then to go over the draft revisions that we have before us on the recommendations prepared in response to that input. So, Lee?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'm going to continue to call this a workshop until you correct me, with the intent of recognizing that we don't have before you a final product. What we have before you is a working document that we're going to try to refine. At our last meeting, we discussed first directed from City Council to consider the potential for changes in the parameters that had been established in that 2007-2008 period for the property. We talked through the history of the development first, and then the redevelopment process that had led up to the establishment of those parameters, and then ultimately the intent and process that proceeded to select interested development interest that ended up essentially being put on hold during this extended recession. The recommendations that you had received in the form of a series of check marks on the graphic that indicated the public lands, the Property and Public Lands Committee recommendations for either retaining the parameters, reconsidering the parameters, or removing the parameter from their perspective, you reviewed, and you gave some discussion in that evening to where you found comfort with the status of those parameters continuing to be the right look, the right character, the right density, the right height, the right setbacks, and where you felt that there ought to be some reconsideration, both from the perspective of should we allow for greater flexibility than what was originally included? Has there been a change in the market conditions? Do we feel that there's a better approach, or should we allow for different approaches? So there was discussion that led us, both at the consultant level and working with Kathy, to understand your interest that evening. We asked you to make further comment. We summarized those comments and returned a summary to you. But we are trying to essentially work with you to develop a consensus so that ultimately you can make a recommendation back to City Council on the nature of the parameters that can be included within the RFQ if that goes out. We included discussion that evening of the parameters list by list, topic by topic, parameter by parameter, including density and height and design. And you'll remember that we also included a series of graphics that represented, first, some development that has already occurred within the metropolitan area that we can use as examples of density and character and design, because what my statement to you was, not every density, not every height, not every development with the same numbers looks the same or feels the same within the community. And we wanted you to have direct experience, and you did look at those both in field trips, and we appreciate that, and also the graphics that we included. We also included 6 example development layouts for this site specifically. And we did that not to recommend to you that one form or another is what you should be seeking when you seek a developer, so much as to get you thinking through the potential variety of layouts, the potential variety of building types, and how each of those might best fit in to the site. And what the result of that, I hope, was for you to consider the parameters and see where the parameters might have been overly restrictive or give a wrong direction. And so in the feedback that you gave us, we read that first and foremost to suggest that you were seeking greater flexibility in the document, and therefore to encourage greater use of the developer's recognition of the market and recognition of the development types that best fit the site. You were not, in your responses to us, looking for greater specificity in what the design must include. In fact, you were encouraging greater development innovation. I think the chair laid out quite well what we are intending to get here, which is what I'm calling the comfort zone that establishes enough direction that the developers will understand what we're seeking, and yet not so much that they feel that this is not an investment worth pursuing. We're hoping at the end of this process that these are clear direction that allows for the development to pay its way, if you will, that development interests will find this an opportunity that is worth investing in. We started from the parameters that were put in place in 2008. You made your comments. We've evaluated those, and we have made a draft set of suggested changes where you have indicated interest in reconsidering those. And so I'm going to run through area by area, if you will, first starting with the use. First and foremost, the original, which is labeled here on the left side as being previous, and the new potential draft on the right side. The previous indicated that the primary use was residential, that there may be some flexibility to have some portion of the site being not residential, but primarily this was a residential site with an interest in having a mix where the density on the western side may have been lower, and the potential for the 2/3 on the eastern side being potentially multifamily and a higher density. Based on your discussions, your suggestions, we rewrote that to read, the use of the 10-acre parcel is envisioned as primarily residential, consideration of various housing unit types at various price points, and both ownership and rental products are encouraged, with the recognition that including that 1/3, 2/3 is a design suggestion that may not have convinced you were going to get the best from the site. And so by allowing us to eliminate that 1/3, 2/3, you may end up with that same development type, but we're not stipulating it with this text. We have greater detail in the original previous discussion about how much and the nature of potential non-residential uses. There's a maximum listed in the previous parameters of 12,000 square feet, and it includes the lack of a freestanding commercial building if that were proposed, that was not acceptable. So we have changed that in our recommendations to you, which continues to encourage that if there's non-residential, it tends towards the Western Avenue side of the site. That is essentially saying generally located within the B2 zoning district where it currently lies on that eastern side of the site. Be well integrated into the overall development and serve as an amenity or additive use to the development surrounding neighborhoods and overall business district. Recognizing that what we don't want to do is create greater over capacity of commercial or other non-residential uses that would essentially compete with existing businesses. We're looking for, if there is a non-residential use, it is contributing to the greater vitality of the downtown. That it be distinct from uses in the core of the central business district to support continued focus on Market Square and the surrounding area as the community's commercial and social center. Any non-residential use generated regular customer traffic should generally be oriented and accessed from Western Avenue. So again, an orientation to the east side of the site if it is non-residential. So I'm past now the got to go back to this third item under use. There was essentially prohibition of office uses listed within the parameters. And hearing our discussion, we're suggesting a revision that says developer creativity and market responsiveness is encouraged with the knowledge that the city will evaluate each proposal for compatibility and sensitivity to the surrounding neighborhoods, the business district, and the overall character of the community. High quality architectural design, quality materials, site layout, landscaping, and amenities are expected to create a development that strengthens the diversity and diversifies the housing choices available within the city. There is no prohibition on office, and if there is office, it may, or most likely would occur above first floor commercial uses, retail uses. It's not anticipated to be essentially mixed above residential uses. That's just not likely to be supported in the marketplace, but we're leaving that to the developers. And we're not indicating to them in advance that a office use, still a less than primary use of the site, because we have included it at the top of this entire use question, it is primarily residential, so that if there is non-residential uses, they are supportive, but not the primary use of the site. In the area of density and open space, item 4 states a very specific maximum 13 residential units per acre as a density on the overall site. Recognizing that many of the developments to the north and to the south of this site exceed that 13 dwelling units per acre. In fact, exceed the 15 dwelling units to the acre that would have been allowed if it includes affordable units as suggested by the ordinances. Many of the development that occur to the north and the south far exceed that 13 to 15 dwelling units to the acre, and I think that we were reading your comments to suggest let's not predispose that is the upper end. And so this indicates density should not exceed permitted densities in surrounding residential developments. In all cases, the appearance of density should be mitigated through site plan and building design that incorporates various techniques used in combination, including but not limited to siting and orientation of buildings, setbacks, transition areas, open space, articulated building massing, and the selection of architectural styles that minimize the appearance of mass. So it turns it to the developer to prove the point. How does density work on the site, and how does it transition, and how is it compatible with the surrounding uses? Bring us a good development, and that 13 to 15 dwelling unit per acre is not the cap that we're going to measure against. It is, we will measure against compatibility with the rest of the community. Further on density and open space, it continues to recognize the importance of the city's inclusionary housing ordinance, and so we're not moving off of that fundamental, which is in order to support the potential for there being a broad range of housing price points, if you will, available throughout the community, and in particular in support of affordable units that, or workforce units, that we are mandating essentially that they still recognize the appropriateness of the city's inclusionary housing ordinance as it's applied to this site. Still on density and open space, the committee recommends that the maximum of 3 stories in height be permitted, was the previous standard. This is listed as building heights at the perimeters of the site may be consistent with the height of the surrounding residential uses. Buildings up to 4 stories may be permitted internal to the site and along the Western Avenue in case where building design is consistent with the architectural style selected by the developer and the appearance of mass and height is mitigated by a strong land plan as noted in parameter 4. If you can make the site work, choose a height that is not directly adjacent to much shorter uses and buildings along the perimeter of the site, so keep it internal or keep it at the Western Avenue side, it's more likely to be compatible with the surrounding property. So the cap at 3 stories, which seemed inconsistent in our discussions with the requirement at the time of underground parking, if that was going to be the form of development, is unlikely to be supported in the marketplace. Our recommendation to you is hold to a 4-story maximum, but only allow that essentially in the place where it has the least impact on the surrounding properties by holding it in the middle or along Western Avenue itself. Under the previous density and open space section, we talked about the, this is a very parallel responsibility on the use of architectural details to help reduce the impact of any building massing height. Whether it's 2 stories, 3 stories, or 4 stories, it still is the responsibility to use architecture in a way that will make the building more compatible and appropriate for Lake Forest. We retained the 30% open space recommendation, and so we have combined both the 30% open space and the discussion about the potential use or continuing the Franklin Park location. But there is a change here which says the open space calculations excluding parking lots, driveways, parking lot islands, and public-private right-of-way, but may include open space surrounding the oak tree and Franklin Park or any portion of the park if it is retained as part of the development plan. So we're saying we're giving credit for those open spaces. The fundamental, we would say, is don't have any less open space than you already have, but ultimately 30%, we'd like to also retain as much of the open space and the landscaping of Franklin Park if we can. But if the developer can show you that there's a more a park or open space layout that is more beneficial not just to this site but to the surrounding community, allow them the opportunity to make that presentation to you. development should be designed to integrate with the surrounding neighborhoods, consistent with the statements that were in the previous standard. We, however, recommended that you not have the limitation on access to Franklin Place, that you allow the development to show that it can be accommodated without creating stress on the surrounding uses of land. And so rather than dictating the grid pattern that was discussed in the prior standards, or dictating the lack of any access to Franklin Place if there was multifamily uses, we're saying, show us a great plan that accommodates circulation, that does not isolate this development from the surrounding, in fact, integrates it with the rest of the community. The prior standards required underground parking, which is inconsistent if the building type turns out to be a townhouse type. We would strongly indicate that covered parking be required. But covered parking includes garages that are under a two-story townhouse. That's not underground parking. So allow the design flexibility to make sure that there's adequate parking that meets your standards for parking, so that you don't spill out onto the adjoining streets, but don't necessarily require the financial investment of underground parking that will dictate the type of building that you'll get in return. So again, work towards the flexibility of design. Let them bring you the best design. We continue to support the need for Western and Laurel Avenue to provide additional parking than it currently does, on-street parking. That's essentially the terms of 14 are identical in both of these. Continue the desire to protect the oak tree south of the former municipal service building, and adequate open space around the tree to support its continued viability. So it's not just the tree itself. You gotta leave enough space that we have the chance that will not have a direct impact by the development itself. And again, if Franklin Park is not preserved, at a minimum, we need the same amount or more of open space to compensate for it elsewhere on the site. 17, which talks about site amenities being, primarily in support of pedestrian-friendly pedestrian amenities, is essentially the same. These are retained word for word. Under setbacks in 18, the original standard meeting essentially the underlying zoning standard. In the case where you're going to have a mixed building type, where not all the buildings are the same, you may find that the setbacks need to be adjusted so that they are more appropriate for the building type itself. So again, allow a good design to be presented to you that does not have the same exact setback standards throughout the site. The original, I think this is a rewording without a change in the intent of the approval process. We know that this is a community that must have a very public evaluation of the design before it's ultimately approved. And we can, with this language, intend to assure both the community and the developer that there will be a very public and thorough evaluation. But by using guidelines, we're hoping to make sure that they recognize it's our intent to bring the best quality to the community in a planning process that you will all feel comfortable with, that the community will feel comfortable with, that will allow them to get from proposal to approval in a rational approach. It continues to involve the Plan Commission in that process. So we know that the development selection process is likely to be largely related to the proposal itself and will include the Public Lands Committee's recommendation on the method and on the selection of the developer themselves, but ultimately the Plan Commission will be directly involved in how does this impact the community from a development impact standpoint. Review of the design, review of the development at the time for entitlement, which is essentially what you do now. So it is wording that's trying to assure the developers that this is a not necessarily streamlined process, but rational process of development approval. So you have, I think, not a earth-shaking shift in what you had for standards and at the time that this was originally presented to you in 2008. This is more refinement based on what we know market conditions are and on the intent of attracting developers to this site that will present to you ultimately something that fits within the community. Take your immediate questions, or I will sit and respond to you when you have
I
questions.
think at this point, I'd like to add another item to the agenda. At this point, to give the commission, before we go to public testimony, to ask you a few questions if we might, so that it clarifies things for those attending. Okay, are there any questions of our consultant at this point? Go ahead.
I have several, Mr. Chairman, if I may. On the subject of underground parking, can you put that slide back up, that address the parking?
There's two here.
Well,
The second piece is the same as it was originally, but the items 12 and 13 are the ones that see changes.
So no specific type of parking is recommended in this draft. Is that correct?
There is no requirement for underground parking as there had been in the previous version. There is not a stipulation that says that it should be predominantly, well, we didn't include covered parking as a term. We probably could and probably should. I don't think that required parking should be surface parking lots. And I think that we would all feel more comfortable if we included terms that stipulated the requirement for covered parking.
That's where I was going. With respect to the open space calculation, the proposal is that 30% of the development be open space, but that might include the Oak Tree area and Franklin Park if that's part of the development. If Franklin Park was part of the development area, what percent of the entire development area would the Oak Tree and Franklin Park constitute right now?
Great question, and I should have an answer for it, but I don't.
Okay.
But we can probably calculate that quickly. This is a 10-acre site. I'm guessing that Franklin Park is about an acre.
So 10%. Okay. I think an answer to that would be helpful.
I will get one.
Going on to this, the issue of 4 stories potentially allowed in the middle or along Western Avenue. For the rest of the development area, is there a recommendation that that would be capped at 3 stories, 3.5 stories, builder's option?
You had an existing 3-story max. I would hate to retreat from that, but in any case, I think you need to be able to assure the community that a transition, particularly to the west, which are single-family residences directly to the west, that there would be adequate buffering and transition, and probably transition in height as well. That's a more difficult edge for me to suggest that 3 stories makes sense right at that western boundary. I'm a little bit more comfortable with 3 stories being on the Franklin Place side. But again, I'm not recommending a specific development to you or a development type, and I would prefer that where you have comfort in the flexibility of being able to evaluate the development that's proposed to you, that you give yourself that leeway.
Would covered parking underneath a multi-story townhome, would that be considered a story or a half story or?
Yes.
Which?
A story, unless it is
Full
half
story.
buried. Right.
Okay. All right, and then finally, I believe in the original recommendations, there was a statement with respect to city ownership of the land.
In the process section at the very end, I believe you're right. Let me go back there.
Has that been addressed in the new draft?
In the original, it says, "The committee recommends that the city council consider retaining ownership of the property until final development approvals are granted or until other mechanisms and other mechanism is in place to assure the development in a manner that is acceptable to the city council." Our text suggests the city intends to work with the selected developer through the entitlement process to assure that a high-quality built project guided by these development parameters is approved in a timely manner, and further to coordinate with the selected developer to establish a timeline and approach to build out of the site that provides certainty and balances the interests of all affected parties to the extent possible. It is not stipulating, nor did the original, that the city own it into the future. It is entirely possible with these parameters that the city could be the owner of the land and not the buildings itself on a land lease potential. I don't know. It's entirely practical that they would want to develop it in phases that allowed for a portion of the site to be acquired at a time. I don't know. That's allowable under these parameters.
So the draft as written now would allow some flexibility with respect to the ownership issue.
That's correct.
Over the course of the development. Okay, that's all I have, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
I had a couple things. On number 4, the redraft of number 4, I'm not trying to be too picky here, but it says density should not exceed permitted densities in surrounding residential developments. What is and where is surrounding residential developments?
You could define that. I guess I was looking,
What did you mean, I guess?
yeah, I was looking for properties going north, going south, going west. For
Of
some,
that property, and it's not meant to be broadly defined as Lake Forest or even beyond that, it's that specific property, north, east, west, south.
I guess I was not anticipating that you would look at this as being abutting properties. I think
Okay.
that I was looking for a larger area. In 2008, the city did a study that included the densities in that area. This is the site right here.
Okay.
So we have documented it. It's easier for me to read it over here, but the ranges here are from 34.7 units to the acre at the 1301 northwestern side. The Crystal Point is 20.8 dwelling units per acre. Woodview is the low-density, single-family residential densities of 1.69 dwelling units to the acre. But then you go back up, you've got 22.5 units, 28.2 units, 14 units to the acre, 12. So you see quite a bit of variability. Rather than tying it to specific buildings, we were suggesting that you tie it to the underlying allowable densities that the zoning in these immediately surrounding properties. The property is zoned in part residential, in part business, but its functional use has been for many years this public use. Before that, the commercial use at the intersection, but I don't think that the underlying zoning necessarily represents what the zoning should be going forward in the future, or the standard that you necessarily have to put in place. So does it make sense to reflect the characteristics of the surrounding? I think you're going to have a greater chance of allowing for compatibility if you reflect densities maximum that reflect those adjacent districts, not the current underlying one. To answer your question directly, I was thinking, and you can put a boundary on this if it makes sense, about these areas that were studied at the time in 2008. So I was looking what amounts to more than a block to the north, more than a block to the south.
So I guess it's a question as to whether we want to be more specific.
Yes, that's right.
And then one other question I had was, maybe this totally goes without saying, but is it implied here that we have one developer?
No.
And is that something that we are, so to talk about that, is that a positive or a negative?
Well, it's easier for us to write terms that talk about the developer, even if it is multiple developers. It will be the responsibility of the PP&L committee to be specific in the language used in the RFQ and RFP on how they will select the developer. But it's very likely that the developers will be narrowed to a short list of very qualified developers and then asked to present a proposal, each of them asked to present a proposal. Using that approach, it's likely that you're going to get what amounts to a master developer who is the lead developer of a team. They may or may not choose a single land use, a single building type, a single subcontractor developer, but generally it's a stronger relationship between the city and the master developer than necessarily subdivide the property into a series of developer interests. So
is that normal, or is that expected in here, or do we need to define that? Or put some parameters?
to the extent that it should not have an impact on the land use decision or the bulk decision or the decision about how it fits in with the rest of the community, I don't think that it's appropriate in the design parameters. It may very well be a parameter in the RFQ, but that's beyond what we're talking about here. Now, I'm sure that if there is a strong desire on the part of the Plan Commission to encourage the city to have a single developer or multiple developers, that PPO&L would take care.
The issue that I have sounds pretty basic, and that is you don't want to, you would not want to have the integrity of this development coming apart because you have multiple designs and developers and so forth, and that likely would not happen, but I didn't know if we needed to.
Well, may I suggest that rather than dealing with the potential for multiple developers, that you may want to make a recommendation that it's developed under a single unified plan.
Well, that would help me. Okay.
Mike, I had one
Go ahead,
question.
Augie.
Lee, we've been, over the past couple of months, taking a look at the parameters that were developed, say, 6-7 years ago, refining them, as you say, re-examining them and so forth. And we've been working on the parameters that were already established. Is it appropriate to discuss adding a parameter that the city may want to know about as a response from the developers in the request for proposal? And specifically, what I'm thinking about is kind of along the lines of what John was just saying. Would we want to know if the developer sees this after he's done as having covenants, restrictions, a homeowners association, architectural guidelines? Do we want to know that in the response to the request for proposal? It's an added parameter that's not being asked right now.
Interesting. I don't think that we would want to premeditate that it is an ownership structure, because it may very, part of the parameters here is that the potential for quality rental units is something that the city would consider. But I think what you're addressing is the issue of long-term management of the site and assuring that if it is multiple individual owners or multiple large-scale owners, that there is a set of conditions that the city can continue to enforce going forward into the future for assuring that it is, that things like parking and traffic and impacts off the site are assured within the original plan. They are enforceable as part of the original plan. The same thing in terms of the quality of the improvements and the maintenance of the building. So the answer is, I think that it's a great opportunity for the city to stipulate that it must have a management plan for taking this forward into the future. I don't think that you can stipulate at this stage that an association or some other form of authority governing it would be the only or best way. Let's ask for that plan and ask the developers to assure us that that's the best way to do it.
And I would just add that that is something that we would require as part of the final plan that came before the Plan Commission for review. We would ask those kinds of questions. So it may be a bit premature to get too specific in these parameters.
Thanks.
Quick question. If residential is proposed and approved for this location, it would be subject to existing city code that would allow for a portion of affordable housing, correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
So why reference it in the development guidelines?
One, I think that you are trying to give as much direction to the developer in advance of them first saying, I'm interested, and second, here's my proposal, that you are serious about making sure that this addresses that affordable housing issue.
Okay.
And in background, I can add, the reason that it was included the first time is because the inclusionary housing ordinance does allow, at the city council's discretion, for payment in lieu of on-site units. And at least during the first discussion, there was a strong feeling that the code requirement for both affordable and/or moderately priced units be met by on-site units and not by payment in lieu of. So there was a back discussion on that.
But why have the provision? Why allow for it if we're not going to review it within the context of the rest of the overall proposal? I mean, I'm not sure we ever really discussed it in previous meetings. I'm just curious why we would single it out, as opposed to 100 other issues in the current city code that we would want to enforce.
We can say that in the original document, there was essentially a bonus potential on the basis of density. It indicated that it was 13 dwelling units to the acre under, as a cap, but that if the affordable, I forget the term, if that portion of the ordinance is imposed, then they have affordable units or moderate rate units in there, that the cap can go up to 15 units. So there was a public policy directive essentially saying we're supportive of this to the point of saying that we could allow for greater density if you meet those standards.
I have one question, Lee, and that is, on the cover page of the analysis and recommendations given us before the meeting, it indicated that you had interviewed potential developers and done a market analysis. What can you tell us in terms of what, if this is approved, even with some amendments and revision, what kind of response we may or may not get at this point?
First, you're going to get a greater or more aggressive response than you did a year ago. The market is reviving, both from what we're hearing about equity ownership, meaning owner-occupied types of residential units and apartment units. The market conditions continue to change. The market conditions, or the comments that we're hearing from developers directly, is that they continue to be interested in a site that has diversity, not one single building type, that there's a strong desire to at least allow for a mix of building types, a mix of uses on the site. Not necessarily a mix of retail and commercial, but for those that are focusing on residential units, to be not a single building type, but potentially several. So the answer in terms of the kind of response we get, I think that you're going to get an active, engaged development community that we couldn't have predicted several years ago. They are eager to be ready as the market reemerges. Remember that developer looks more like 3 years out and less like this next coming year. They need enough time to do the planning, to do the development approval process, and get it in place when the market really is strong.
Okay, thank you. Further questions by commissioners? Let's then move to the public comment period of our meeting. Are there people who would like to testify? If so, could you stand, please? And I'd like to swear everyone in. Okay. Do you solemnly declare and affirm that the testimony you are about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge? Thank you very much. I would like to remind the speakers, too, that you've got up to 5 minutes to speak, and that Kathy will be keeping time, and that we request that everybody please be respectful of other speakers and all points of view expressed. Okay, who would like to be first? Please come. Just state your name and address too, please.
My name is Stephen Bruin. I live at 1261 Burr Oak Road, which is just north of this property that we're talking about today. And I guess the first comment I'd like to make is that I feel that the whole premise for the work that was done 5 or 6 years ago was based on maintaining the current zoning designation of B2. And I think that premise is false or flawed, because I don't think it accurately reflects what's going on in that neighborhood. I believe one of the recommendations from this committee should be to change the zoning to either GR1 or GR2, both of which provide for single-family, two-family, and multiple-family structures. So it would be in line with what he just suggested, that they want a variety of building types. It would preclude any development in terms of commercial, business, or retail, which I don't think is appropriate for what that property represents today. Many years ago, there were businesses on that property. That has not been the case for many years now. And I think to put business there today really wouldn't be beneficial for the city and wouldn't be beneficial for the surrounding neighborhood. So that would be my first recommendation. Let's change the zoning designation of that property. And I think it would also then help clear up a little bit of the confusion in terms of what we're trying to recommend with these requirements. Because it seems to me, from a layman's point of view, we're trying to create a hybrid zoning area that isn't reflected in any of the current zoning designations within Lake Forest. Rather than do that, why don't we start with the basis of a existing zoning designation that reflects, for the most part, what we want done. Then we can make recommendations in terms of requirements that might refine that somewhat. But at least you've got that basis, which has proven to be beneficial for all of Lake Forest for as long as these zoning designations have been in effect. And it would then be consistent with what we've been doing for many, many years in Lake Forest, as opposed to trying to create some hybrid model that I don't think is going to work for Lake Forest. Regarding what the current market will bear, perhaps there should be some consideration given to having a working committee made up primarily perhaps of staff, someone from the board here, that has familiarity with developers, has contacts in that field, and talk with them. And it sounds like some of that work may have already been done, perhaps informally. We could make it a little more formal to get a better sense of what these developers are looking for. But you can at least go to them with the premise that it's going to be built within the framework of this zoning law within Lake Forest. Tell us what you think is reasonable. And based on that kind of feedback, then some of these requirements you're trying to develop might be more well-defined in terms of feasibility financially, and clearly that's a big factor today. Okay?
Thank you very much. Jan?
Thank you. Jan Gibson, 59 East Franklin Place. I live directly west of the proposed development. There are 4 houses, if you take a look at a plan, that I'm in a single-family home ranch house. I'm going to try to relate these to the parameters. The numbers are going to be out of order, but I have about 6 quick points here. As you know, we live in a very dense development or area, neighborhood, and with parameter number 4, it's been stated by Mr. Brown that some of the condos have gone well beyond the 13 units per acre, which is why we don't need more density. In other words, we'd like to keep the density down. With the plan at 13 per acre and adding another 20 units for making it 15 units per acre or more, we're going to have even more people and more cars. If you take 2 cars per unit, let's say, you're going to have 150, 300 extra cars in there, and it's going to be a lot of traffic and a lot of people. The 4-story buildings, I didn't know we were basing things on stories. I thought it was per so many feet per an area. And even if it's on Western Avenue, where you have the density or 4 stories or whatever, you're going to have a tunnel effect. We have that almost now, and I would encourage all of you to start at Regents Row. I walk down to the train station every day from where I live, so I don't really walk past Crystal Point and the long building, Horizontal Hancock or whatever on the east side of the street. But if you walk past Regents Row, you have that tunnel effect even there with just one side of the street. That building really looms very close to this street. And if you walk north along Crystal Point is well set back, but you have that loom effect, that tunnel effect if you walk on the east side of the street. Those buildings are very close. That area is very close to the street. So 4 stories is going to be mighty tall, okay. We all prefer residential, and if you turn and I know you have, at Laurel and Western, take a look at the traffic around the Grill on the weekends. It's very hard to see, very hard to move around that intersection. And please don't mention stoplights, because we don't want another, but it's a difficult one. Regarding number 2, regarding the Pocket Park and Franklin Park, which is number 16, if you go out, you'll see that we have croquet, and these are people from not necessarily who live in the area. They are from Lake Forest, but they play croquet in the area. You see a yoga every Saturday and Sunday, I think, mornings, and these are people who don't live right directly in the area. Or you see elderly people who are out sunning. When I cut across Crystal Point, I go to the hairdresser, and I do cut through Crystal Point, and I've been given permission to do this, but I walk on the sidewalks, and they have sidewalks within Crystal Point. I kind of feel as if I'm trespassing a bit, because it is an association, a condo association. If you eliminate that park, the Pocket Park or Franklin Park, and put courtyard parks in, where some of the designs from the last time you saw courtyards with giving that green space within, there will not be people from outside even sitting there, or they just won't use it. Something has to be along that street to encourage people to use the parks. I think your 30% green space is way too low. Crystal Point has 62% green space. If you look at Regents Row, I think it's 5%. I don't think it's 10%, and I don't think it's nearly enough. As I said, it looms. Let me see. No widening of Franklin Place. That's number 11, I believe. Right now it's walkable, usable. We have mature hackberries. We have the Frank Farwell berm. It also provides some privacy, I think, for Crystal Point, because the people who live on the south side of Crystal Point, which is the north side of the street, face that berm, and that berm is quite protected, and it protects them a bit. Whether it's a single developer or multiple developers, as you had just discussed, we obviously want quality materials, quality design, and a unified plan. However you do it, I don't know, but it really needs to be done. And I think both of the entrances, or the ingress and egress, should be on Western. If you remove the berm and put a thoroughfare in right to Franklin, where you encourage people to turn left, you're going to go around Burr Oak. It's almost like a big cul-de-sac as it is right now. It's not for major traffic. If you cut in the back of Crystal Point, that's private property, and I don't think they're going to like that. So I don't think it's really going to improve traffic by ripping out that berm and putting an entrance right there, or even widening Franklin Place. Those are my points. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Sir?
My name is Ed April. I live at 1350 Northwestern, part of Crystal Point. I'm on the board of directors of our building. I've read through this, and I would like to ask for time to have a written rebuttal. There are so many problems with this proposal that I cannot address it in 5 minutes. But I will address 2 points. If you go, and it was already mentioned, if you go to the grill tonight, you'll see all of Western Avenue parking is being used up on a busy night. And this gentleman wants to propose more parking. Every single space from the grill, from the bridge north to where I live, the north and on Thomas, is parking. Unless you put in double-decker parking, there's no more space for parking. I don't know where he's gonna find these parking spaces on Western Avenue. I thought when I moved here 12 years ago, I'm in a high-rise 35 feet. He now wants to put it up higher than 35 feet. He wants 4 stories. The zoning is 35 feet. We have underground parking for all of our owners, plus outside parking. He wants not to have parking inside for all of the owners of all these places. I'm a retired physician. If you have a doctor's office and you have outside parking, where do you put the tenants' parking if it's outside? When you have, say, 7 or 8 patients in the office at one time. I go to an ophthalmologist in Old Orchard. He has this gigantic lot. He has 10 patients in there. That's 10 spaces. Where do you find all these spaces? Do you limit the owners in the daytime that they can't park because we now have commercial property? But I would like to have time to write a rebuttal. I'd like to talk to my board, and I would like to give a written rebuttal to this plan. We have 200 families living in Crystal Point. We have 300 voting citizens. I know the people on Burr Oaks, the last time we had this problem in '08, they were up in arms because they do live on a cul-de-sac, a nice, very quiet little street where there are lots of little children. And once you put a street onto Franklin, people are not going to go west to Western. They're going to go around Burr Oaks because there's less traffic, and they come out on Thomas. So you're now going to make a main street out of a cul-de-sac. I think you have to consider this before you go ahead and destroy the beauty of our neighborhood. Thank you.
Thank you for your, for your testimony. Other people who wish to make comments? Provide input? Okay, thank you very much. So we have before us the written analysis and recommendations. We've had the explanation, we've had the public testimony. I would like to suggest for the commission's consideration here that we go through this document section by section. And to the extent that members would wish to say, hey, this is fine, let's move on, we can do that, but so that we get careful consideration of all of the questions that were asked. And would that be acceptable to the commission? Okay. Well, then, let's start out with the number one, the use category. The analysis on pages 2 and 3, and the recommendation is on page 3 of our document.
Mr. Chairman, is the draft that Lee presented identical verbiage to the recommendations in our packets?
Is it exactly the same?
The text in the PowerPoint is directly taken from the
So you had a side-by-side, okay.
It's identical? Okay, thank you.
Any suggested revisions, additions, whatever, to this section? I have one, so.
On the first one, you're saying?
Yes, this is on use, bottom of page 3. Or excuse me, the middle of page 3.
Right.
I'll start if that's okay. I'll just lob this in as my protest vote, because I'm sure we'll proceed under the general parameters as expressed, but I think this is I think to compel the developers to present a predominantly residential plan is a mistake. And I'd like to think that a 10-acre parcel zoned for business use in a business district would have the ability to allow a developer to propose a commercial use that might be deemed primary if there are residential buffers and considerations in effect that take into consideration the adjoining neighborhoods and the uses around the site. But to compel this to go forward under a principal residential-only scenario with possibly ancillary retail, I think is a potential mistake and a misuse of our property. So I'll start with that, but.
Okay. Any support of that notion from the rest of the commission? Don't see any at this point.
That's fine. I
Point made.
lobbed it in as a protest
Understand.
comment.
Further comments on this first set of recommendation, 1 through 3?
Oh,
Oh, so you're gonna do all 1 through 3. Okay, the question I had was something that was prompted by one of the comments we received. Remind me how this property is zoned. We have a portion that is zoned B2, but the entire thing is not the entire property parcel is not one zoning, right? So could we just be reminded about that?
Yes. The 3-acre portion of the property closest to the corner of Laurel and Western Avenue is zoned B2.
Right.
That's the least intense commercial district in our central business district. Market Square is B4, it steps down to B3, and this is B2. The remainder of the property, essentially
Right,
an
the L
angle,
shape, yeah.
is zoned GR2. GR2 permits, if we took the 7 acres that's zone GR2, would allow, and I'm gonna give you a range, 40 to 45 single-family homes on that 7 acres, or 80 to 95 multifamily units, generally, based on the code, and there's certainly other parameters that would have to be evaluated. The code would allow a height of 40 feet by right in the residential area.
40 feet. Okay, thank you.
How many stories would 40 feet accommodate?
Normally, it would be 3 stories.
Thank you.
Augie?
Only one quick thing. Under the recommendations for item 2, thanks, Mike, it says, by distinct uses from the core central business district to support continued focus on Market Square. Initially, I think you can do that, but I don't know that you can, if a business comes and leaves and another one comes in, you may be in competition with businesses that exist in Market Square. So I'm not quite sure really what the example would be to guarantee that the use be distinct from Market Square. Just kind of raising it as a question. I'm not sure how we ensure that for the long term, if you can.
Would you like to see clarification, or?
Well, maybe just an example of how that could happen.
How about deletion?
What's that?
How about deletion of
Yeah.
that?
Maybe so.
I mean, by
'Cause I don't-
definition, if you're only allowing certain standalone retail uses potentially toward that one corner, how can you emulate anything that would be in competition? I mean, it's just not practical.
I would be in favor of deleting it.
As would I.
This was which one?
This is the reference to, I think.
Bullet
it's
point 3 under
bullet point
2.
Item
three
two.
under 2, which is it's the reference to Market Square being
Okay.
the focus.
Right.
Okay. Can we set that temporarily, so we'll come back
Yeah.
and.
Yeah, sure.
We'll have a motion to, I have one suggested addition to point number 1. Here, I'll hand it out. Could you give this to Kathy? Kathy? Sure. Here. And what it would do is add the following language, and again, this is pursuant to what language that's in the city's strategic plan that was adopted by the mayor and the council last year, which, as stated here, it says that the city should be providing accommodation, opportunity, amenities for a diverse population. I know that with the affordable housing provision in here, it helps accomplish that. But I'm suggesting here that we put in a statement, developers are encouraged to consider the housing products currently available in Lake Forest and identify whether a gap or unfilled need exists with respect to price point, unit type, unit size, or another aspect, and if so, to present a project that somehow addresses that gap.
So help me, where does this go?
It would go under number 1. It would be a sub-point under number,
Keep in that second
yes,
sentence
yes.
for number 1?
I would
Which
keep
has the-
all of 1 and add this.
Okay.
Mr. Commissioner, if you were a developer proposing a project, why would you propose something that is already being offered in abundance elsewhere? I'm just curious what what
The reason
incentive would they have to offer a redundant product?
Well, the question is, in my mind, if, it seems to me that at least at this point today, and I don't know, but nobody knows what the future is. But if, let me simplify this. If the bulk of housing being sold in Lake Forest today is at a certain price point, pick a number, 500,000 to $1 million. That's the most frequent sales we see. That would, you would probably say, well, the developers would probably want to hit that or have a mixed use to cover everything. All this is suggesting they basically tell us what they see is the market opportunities that will allow us to have diversity, residential units, ownership, rentals, whatever. That's all this is designed to do, is to clarify that point number 1. I know that the general statement in sentence 2, that may do it for you, but I'm suggesting this for the clarification for the commission's consideration. Okay? Any other points here in this uses? Well, a motion would be in order. Augie, if you want to, do you want to have a vote on number 3? To delete?
Yeah, I would like to make a motion for deleting bullet point 3 under recommendation 2 in its
Oh, I'm
entirety.
sorry. Okay,
Right.
okay, that's the one. Thank you.
The reference to Market Square.
Yes.
Right.
Okay.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor of deletion of the third bullet under number 2, say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Motion carries. Anything further on the recommendation under uses? Seeing none, we'll proceed to the next thing on density and open space. Those points 4 through 8 are contained on pages 4 and 5 of the document in front of us. Augie?
Mike, the only discussion I would like to have is to maybe add a clarification that came up in Lloyd's discussion with Lee, and that is stories is measured from grade level, not from the first living floor. In other words, when I'm talking about underground parking and how some of the parking sticks a half a story above grade. Where it says build, on item 6, buildings up to 4 stories, to clarify where that's counted from. It's coming from grade level.
Grade level.
Not the first living floor, which in many of the examples that we saw on our field trips, you'd walk up 6 feet to get to the first floor because the parking garage was partially below grade, partially above grade.
Right.
Okay.
Can I pick up on this point?
Sure,
It's
go
really a
ahead.
question. So back to we had talked about the zoning for the southeast corner allowing for 40 feet, measured by feet, right? Why do we now shift to talking about stories here? And in reference to, so I understand that, but why don't we keep it at what the zoning requirement would be, which is 40 feet? Why the distinction? I guess I would have a personal preference for expressing it in feet, which is the same way that the zoning requirements are expressed.
I think simply from the perspective, as Mr. Brown said, to provide some flexibility. I will say that that portion of our zoning code probably hasn't been touched in 40 years, so that 40-foot reference probably was written at a time where floor-to-ceiling heights might have been different. So you could certainly do it either way, but I think 4 stories, as written in the parameters, the guidelines, really puts forward an intent of what you're looking for. And if it's 4 stories above grade, that may be more reflective of your intent than simply stating 40 feet. But you could certainly approach it either way. Keep in mind that these are guidelines. These aren't hard and fast rules that a developer will need to follow, but only a sense that's being put out there to help a developer move in the direction that seems to be what the community desires.
Kathy, how would we consider this aspect? As you know, I think this is somewhat problematic because when you offer 4 stories, there's a tendency, as was the case with bulk, when you establish bulk, that you go right to 100% of bulk were allowed. And I wonder if we allow 4 stories to happen internally or along Western Avenue, that we'll go right to 4 stories there because the developer has the opportunity to do so. How do we manage this?
You certainly might. Again, keep in mind, whatever is proposed will come back before the Plan Commission. You will hold a public hearing. I expect you will have many more people in the room than you have tonight because they will be looking at a specific plan. I think importantly, there's language in these conditions that speak to compatibility, that speak to the heights of surrounding buildings. So you're not only saying 4 stories, but you're also presenting the importance of looking at the character of the area.
Would a 4-story variance, would this 4-story guideline necessitate a variance to the B2 zoning?
It's likely that to achieve a unified development of this property, as you stated as something that was desirable, you will look at approving this through a special use permit, similar to what other communities would use as a planned unit development. But the special use permit is the tool that this plan commission and your city council has used to approve developments like Amberley Woods, Willow Lake, something that really doesn't fit into a neat box. So I think you're giving guidelines that will help direct a developer to bring forward a unified plan that is going to let you look at not each piece of that plan individually, but look at how the setback and the height and the building materials and the architectural style selected and the landscaping, how all of that fits together, and you will be making the evaluation of whether that overall development works or doesn't work.
I'm a bit wary of the four-story because typically proposers will try to push the size of the envelope. And so if we put 4 in here, you know, I would guess we're gonna get some suggesting 5. And as I looked at that property on Green Bay Road in Wilmette, that, to me, just wouldn't cut it here on the Laurel Avenue side. I don't know what the rest of the members here thought, but,
I don't disagree, but I think you're still gonna have the opportunity to slap somebody around when they come back with something you think exceeds your sensibilities. So I don't know
Good
that we
point.
need to get hung up on this right now.
okay. What's the pleasure of the commission
But,
on?
I just have a couple more. Kathy, what's the height limits in Amberley Woods? Do you know? Do they go
I don't
4
know. I
stories?
can tell you the hospital off the top of my
Yeah.
I know that one time.
I'm not sure if Amberley Woods isn't on the chart. I don't know why this sticks in my head, and I might be completely off, but I want to say 54 feet
Right.
when I think of the
But that's
condominiums
four-
out
that's
there
4
on Route
stories.
60.
Those are 4
Amberley Woods
stories,
is out
are they
on Route
not?
60.
Those are 4 stories
Mhm.
typically? Or in parts of the development? But there's nothing higher than that in Amberley, as best you recollect.
No.
Any suggested revisions of points 4 through 8?
I heard a suggestion that in number 6, that there be a reference that the height be measured from grade.
Yep.
Maybe my fellow commissioners can refresh me on this. We went and saw some places where townhomes had a garage on the first floor. Were there typically only 2 stories above the garage,
Yes.
or were there 3?
I think 2.
2?
In townhomes,
In the
2,
townhomes, right.
but in apartment or condo units, there was usually a half a story of parking above grade. And I think it's because they didn't have the length to make the ramp for a full story below. So they could only go down a half story. And in those cases, you often had 3 or 4 stories above, when the parking garage was sticking out a half a story. But when it was a pull-in at grade level, it was typically 2 above.
Thank you.
No change.
Yes, it's great. I think that
So the
language.
reference to grade should be
Do
included.
you agree with
Yeah,
that?
I agree.
Yeah, okay.
I do too.
So it's agreed that the buildings up to 4 stories, in parentheses, measured from grade. Does that makes, but, okay. Items 7 and 8? This just reads, in terms of open space, it says a minimum of 30% open space. So if a developer wanted to go 40, or as we heard here, something 40 or 50%, if they so chose.
Yeah, maybe Kathy or Lee would just address to my side. I heard one of the members of the public indicate that they thought 30% was too small. Is 30% an adequate amount of open space for a development project of this nature, or is?
30% is a standard requirement in the code. And not only could the developer bring in something that had greater than 30% open space, but again, when the Plan Commission sees the plan, you could also require that additional open space be added. So
Yeah,
30%.
My problem with that, though, is that one of the things we're trying to do is give potential developers a sense of what the guidelines will be, and I don't think we want to put them through the drill of coming in with an RFP or you know, with a proposal, and then we go, well, it works, but we need 50%. You know, I mean, that's just going to derail them and defeats the purpose of what I think we're trying to do here.
And I think, again, what will be important is when you see all of these aspects come together. It's really hard, and I think Commissioner Kuchman referenced this, that it's hard to say that 30 is exactly the right number, or 4 stories in certain areas is exactly the right number. It's going to be an overall high-quality project, and I think that's what these parameters try and say, that overall the community's looking for something that has these general characteristics.
I was only
Mr.
going
Brown?
to reinforce what Kathy's saying, is that this is another example where 30% isn't always 30%, where the impact of that open space, if it is in larger usable spaces, has much more impact than if we're starting to count all the little green spaces in between buildings and the like. You're ultimately going to be saying, are the open space contributing to the character of this community? And 30% is just a number to get them started. If it turns out that 30% is, you know, spread pretty thin across the entire site, and there really isn't a usable, functional open space for people to gather in, and it contributes to the sense of walkability, you need to reject that. These standards aren't ultimately going to be just a simple checkoff that they met the standards and therefore they get selected. The other last thing I would add is going back to the issue of stories versus height. What we have seen in too many communities is when the height standard is the metric, that the developers will sacrifice the architectural character of the roof line in order to get underneath that height limit.
That's a good point.
And so what you get is flat to shallow pitch roofs that don't reflect the integrity of the style or type of architecture that was chosen. Stories, they get the flexibility of saying, is this a 10-foot high story? Is it an 8-foot high story? And reflecting what the market is demanding in terms of the character of the quality of development you're seeking.
Okay. Nothing further on 7 or 8?
7, 8, fine.
Okay, we'll move on to streets and access. Item recommendations number 9, 10, and 11. Any discussion, revision?
None.
Seeing none, we'll move on to parking. Those are recommendation, bottom of page 6, top of page 7, recommendations number 12, 13, and 14. Discussions, motions?
None.
Seeing none?
No, I'm
I
just
did
reading.
hear a comment earlier about covered.
Right.
That
Yeah.
I'm thinking,
Mr. Brown had suggested that be added.
I guess the question is, where is it added?
We'll go on number 12, adequate on-site covered parking.
it could be in 13.
Okay.
The covered parking
Alternatives?
should be encouraged or is encouraged, or e.g. covered parking after alternatives.
So that's, okay.
Is there objection to that addition? Seeing none, it'll be so added to 13.
Okay.
14?
Fine.
Okay.
Where would additional public parking be on Western? There was a comment made by, again, a member of the public that there isn't. that We're already out of room.
I make a comment, there is no extra, see, once you have double-decker parking on Western Avenue, there is no more space for parking. I walk that street.
No, that's why I'm asking the question. So, just want to get a response.
I think the Laurel Avenue is the easy one. That was pre-stated that it shouldn't go west of the existing commercial development, but that there isn't enough parking on that side. On Western, I think it's more of making certain that the access points don't reduce the amount of parking that's there. The more access points you're going to have on Western, the less parking you're going to have available. I don't have an answer to the question of whether or not we would encourage or want to have two-sided parking, on both sides of Western. It is possible that the design could incorporate diagonal parking and therefore get a greater number of stalls, or perpendicular parking in the greatest density. But what we're saying is, one, don't count the parking on Western or Laurel towards the count that you require for on-site parking, but recognize that this is an opportunity to make sure that where there is the ability to put on-street parking to support the adjacent uses, do that. That's
Well, item 14 reads that the committee recommends that additional on-street public parking on Western.
Yeah, we could probably rewrite that to say additional on-street parking on Laurel and maintain the on-street parking on Western.
To me, the way it's worded implies a widening of Western. I mean, the creation of some sort of at least parallel parking environment. I mean,
You can certainly change that language to consider. I can tell you that when the grill went in at its current location, the parking directly east, on the east side of Western Avenue there, was changed from parallel parking to diagonal parking. And there was the thought at that time of taking that diagonal parking further down Western, and there was a decision not to assure that when this site developed, that we'd really look at what that streetscape should be.
So that-
Whether additional diagonal parking would be appropriate there against the tracks, may or may not be. There was more concern about the streetscape, but we could certainly word that to say explore or consider.
So I have a question.
if I may, I mean.
Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. Oh, sorry, Commissioner Anderson, go ahead.
Sorry, I kind of jumped in, but why is this something that the developer has to,
Well, that was my question.
isn't this a city issue? Isn't that the city's consideration? It's not the developer's consideration.
Well, what we haven't defined yet is if it's a sale of property, how much are you selling?
Yeah, exactly.
The question is, you are currently the owner of the property that a portion of which may ultimately be right-of-way, if that's the best way of handling the overall development plan.
If
Or
I'm,
park.
just
Or
a
a park.
point of reference, Kathy, it appears as if we've either acquired or paved over a portion of the railway right-of-way south of Laurel, correct? To create diagonal parking actually abutting the tracks.
I believe we are at the railroad right-of-way. Perhaps we went into it a little bit.
I'm looking
I
at,
can't say that for sure.
well, I'm looking at a Google Earth image, and across from the grill on Laurel, for example, we do 45-degree park along the railway. I'm assuming that's right-of-way that we've acquired somewhere along the way.
You may not have acquired it, you may have received approval from the,
Well, yes,
from the
exactly.
railroad.
We've acquired the right-of-way, or, the,
I don't
the
recall
easement.
whether that was, at least at the time those diagonal spaces were constructed, that may have all been city right-of-way, and when we acquired it, I don't know.
I mean, maybe we amend the language to suggest that we at least completely investigate the possibility of extending what appears to be the right-of-way south of Laurel Avenue to the area north of Laurel Avenue abutting the property. I mean, I can pass this if this would help.
Kathy, what language were you thinking of in number 14?
See what I'm saying?
In response to Commissioner Anderson's question, The reason this is in these parameters is because there was a recognition that there is a parking
Deficit,
demand issue
yeah.
there right now. When the grill was first approved for that location, parking was identified as a problem, and in fact, the grill customers and employees were supposed to be parking on the other side of the railroad tracks at the north end of the Scott Street lot. That's a block and a half away and didn't happen. So the reason it's included is to assure that as we're looking at this whole area, that we're considering some very practical needs of parking. So that could be rewritten, because I think there was the thought that if it was appropriate for the streetscape and appropriate for the development, that we might look at extending that diagonal parking. That could be rewritten to parking on Western and Laurel Avenues be explored in conjunction with the new development. You could certainly, rather than provided, you could have some words that require us to study it or investigate it, but we could certainly modify that language so that it's not a requirement.
Be fine with
Is there
that.
objection to inserting, substituting explored for provided?
Or words to that effect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
I think this is Commissioner Kuchman's.
Okay. Shall we move on to preservation of existing landscape elements? Those recommendations are items 15 and 16 on the bottom of page 7. Preserving the existing oak tree, and if Franklin Park is not preserved, provide an area for public use that is equal to or larger than the area now known as Franklin Park. Okay.
I'm in the why bother department. I mean, it's a 30% open space requirement. That includes Franklin Park today. It includes Franklin Park or the equivalent thereof tomorrow.
Is that how this is going to read, that the oak tree and Franklin Park are included in the 30% calculation?
I think yes, that was the intent, is to, if whatever open space is on the site, we have stipulated explicitly the preservation of the oak tree and some property around it to protect it, but open the opportunity for Franklin Park to be either relocated or redesigned, but that in total, those two open space areas contribute to the count of 30%.
Let me just think out loud here for a second. Let's say Franklin Park is not developed, and that counts towards the open space. There's 10%. I don't know what the oak tree would be, but maybe that.
Another 10, say.
Then that means the rest of the development has 10% open space. Now that's problematic, I think.
But again, the open space requirement is based on its ability to integrate properly with the context of everything around it. If 10% here and 10% here, and then 10% sprinkled in doesn't fulfill that requirement, you slap them around and you get something that works. I mean, you're basically saying on a 10-acre site,
No, I'm with you.
you know, we're not gonna get rid of more than, or you don't have to get rid of necessarily more than 30% of your usable land. So,
Lee?
This is a finesse question. It was really intended in part to say Franklin Park as a usable area, as a place for croquet and some of the other activities. There ought to be some space equivalent or larger within this area that can be used in that kind of purpose, as opposed to small little patches throughout the site. Even a network of patches is not going to provide the kind of open space that Franklin Park currently is providing the community.
We'll slap them around, Jeff.
Okay. So do I take that to mean we keep 15 and 16 as is? Okay. Moving on to 17, page 8.
It's unchanged, right?
That's under site amenities. The recommendation is to retain all of the prior development parameters. Oh, it's okay, okay, we'll move then to 18, under setbacks. Reflect the applicable zoning setbacks for the site and the traditional character of Lake Forest neighborhoods and streetscapes. Discussion? Seeing none? Move on to 19. Process. Oh, wait a minute, we did 19. No, we did 18, excuse me. 19 and 20 is on the process as well. I think there were some questions of Lee after his presentation. Was that you, Lloyd?
Regarding ownership?
18 and 19? No.
I'm fine with the
Okay.
recommendation.
Yeah, good. Seeing no, we'll, let me just recap then what we've done, and I think a motion and some discussion can, what we've basically tentatively done is on items number 2, recommendation is to strike bullet number 3, which would be distinct from uses in the core of CBD to support continued focus on Market Square. That would come out. Item number 6, we've revised that, buildings up to 4 stories would be further.
Clay?
Yes.
On item number 2, I believe you wanted to add the language that you passed out as well.
I'm sorry?
Under
Your
item number
language.
2, I believe you had asked to add the language that
This-
you
It was
distributed.
actually item number 1.
It was item 1.
Oh,
And it was
I-
it was a sub-bullet under item, or a bullet under item 1.
Yeah, and I got no response to that, so, does that
Yeah,
mean, let it go? I mean, by that I mean keep it out?
I'm fine with it. I just think it's
Oh, okay.
a self-fulfilling
I would
prophecy
leave
to
it
a
out.
large extent.
Okay.
Yeah, my preference, I don't think
Let's
is
leave
to
it
add
out
it
then.
in.
Okay.
Does staff have a different opinion?
I was confused. Which way are you leaning? Leave it in or
Keep it out,
Keep it up.
keep it out,
And
as being redundant, I take it.
and you were going to item 6 next, correct?
No, actually, yes.
Okay,
yes.
so, just going back to a previous question that I had, we feel strongly enough about the inclusionary housing ordinance to make it, to differ from the existing zoning code and not allow for a potential exclusion to it with penalties.
That's fine.
That's why I'm saying, that's why I want to go to item 5 before we go to item 6.
Okay, so you're saying you remove that?
Well,
I mean, you're asking the question, is 5 necessary?
correct, I'm asking.
Is it necessary, perhaps to the extent that a developer should be aware that this is something that they have to take into account?
But it's
May not
in
know
our,
about?
it's in our code.
Well, they may
For a
not be
residential.
experts in our code. I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there.
Kathy, how do you respond to that, to the statement that there's a lot of other things in our zoning code and so forth, and city policies that aren't in here, but yet this is?
I'll respond in 2 ways.
Okay.
First, I'll reiterate that in the past discussion, it was a very conscious choice by the committee at that time to make it clear that the units were desired on-site, and payment in lieu of the units on-site was not desired. In fact, they talked about the fact that based on the city's affordable housing policy and moderate housing policy, that in fact this site is located consistently with the directives in that policy that speak to locating affordable and moderately priced housing within walking distance of the train station, of the library, of services. So it was a conscious decision. Secondly, I'll state that you could certainly change this to simply have it be a parameter that states that developers should be aware of the city's inclusionary housing ordinance. So it raises the red flag for them, but then it puts a burden on them to go back and read it.
To me, that though is completely unnecessary with all due respect. I mean, either we care enough about it to say it's not an option in this circumstance for you to avoid this portion of the code, or we eliminate it altogether because it's already in the code.
Well, my response is, I mean, I think if we take it out, I think the city council's gonna put it right back in.
Well,
So, what's the pleasure of the commission?
I'll just say, I didn't think it was necessary, but if it actually is important to, as instructions, if you will, to the developer in their response, then I guess I understand that.
Yeah, this would
For
not,
clarification. I mean, for their clarification.
I don't disagree with anything that was just said in the sense that this site, of all the sites that might be, considered for multiple residential dwellings, does seem to fit that need. It's just a question of whether or not we want to mandate it.
Do we want to add to it, if I understand what Kathy said, to say, in lieu of the payment penalty, it's desired that the units be built? Because from what I understand now, there's an option that if you don't want to build the units, you can pay a penalty per unit?
right.
Well,
Be
I
built
think,
somewhere else.
right,
But that's what it says right now
does
in
it?
the recommendation, in the way I read it at least. It must be met
On the site.
through incorporation of affordable or moderately
But
priced
does
units.
the ordinance give you the option? And so you are meeting the ordinance if you pay the penalty, I guess is where I'm going. Do we want to further clarify to say the recommendation is to build it, not pay the penalty? Because I think that's what the intent is.
That's what it says to me.
Does it?
Yeah.
Must be met.
I mean, that
well,
doesn't preclude a proposal to come in and say, despite this requirement,
Right.
we would propose doing
So
it elsewhere.
it must be met is pretty clear.
Yes.
Must be built. Because the ordinance gives you the option of paying the penalty.
Must be met on the site.
Exactly. Okay. So do we want that? Do we want to recommend that to the city council?
I think it makes sense as stated. I mean, I understand your rationale, Jeff, but,
I'm fine with it if we feel strongly enough that
I feel,
that's the recommendation of this committee. But like you said, I don't know, it's probably coming back regardless of whether we include it or.
speaking for myself, I'll vote to keep it in.
I'm fine with that.
Yeah, I think so.
As will I.
And that's fine.
Okay.
Then we talked about it.
It stays in, okay. Okay, then, again, summarizing, moving on, we had a change to item 13. At the end of the statement, we put in a, for example, covered parking. And then in number 14, we strike the word provided and insert the word explored in its place.
Did you get from grade in number 6?
I thought I did. Did I skip over that one, Kathy?
We went back to 5. I don't know if we.
Oh.
On 6, it's 4
I have it
stories.
in my notes. I'm not
5
sure whether you
stories
just meant-
measured from
4
grade.
stories from.
Yes, 4 stories.
Just seeing if you're awake.
Had cardiac arrest in the audience.
Going back to
That was good.
Okay. It's getting late. Okay, then, I see no further changes.
So then do we need to vote on this?
I would think a motion would be in order to approve the recommendations as revised.
So moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Discussion on the motion?
Just a comment, and I think, and you guys tell me if I'm wrong with this, but what I think we're trying to do is define the rules of the game. To the extent that if you play within these rules, you can play in the game. But that doesn't mean you're gonna win. And if I'm a developer and I see this criteria, and I think we've loosened it up a little bit from 2007, 2008, I think it's going to encourage activity and participation. I think it's going to encourage creativity. And that doesn't mean if I'm a developer that I'm going to come in and challenge the envelope on every one of these criteria. I think if I'm a smart developer, I'm not gonna come in and put up 4 stories, have exactly 30% open space, and do all those types of things, because somebody looking at this to evaluate it would say, why would they pick me? I'm pushing the envelope, I'm really offering no advantage. But, you know, as Ms. Gibson said, Crystal Point, 50% open space. Well, that's because that's because they're so high, you know? So maybe if somebody comes in and says, I'd like to go 4 stories, but I'm gonna offer you 45% open space, you might say, wow, that's great, you know? So I think the fact that we loosened it up to encourage activity, encourage involvement, encourage creativity is a good thing. But I guess, in my view, whoever does the picking of the developer here is probably gonna not pick the guy, the developer, that comes back and challenges everything right to the envelope of what we've allowed. And so I think that there's a little perception coming back that, wow, you know, they can go 4 stories and they can go 30. I don't think that's gonna be the successful developer. So you guys tell me if I'm looking at that wrong, but I think.
No, I think you're right.
Thank you.
Lloyd? I was just going to ask you or Kathy about Mr. April's request for time for a written rebuttal, but I see he's left. I assume that he would have since we're only a recommending body, we're not establishing any rule here. Would Mr. April or others have the opportunity to submit a written rebuttal to City Council as they consider the Plan Commission's recommendations?
Certainly, and any correspondence that we receive will accompany this as it goes before the city council. And then again, we will certainly do all the required public notice at some point in the future when a unified plan is presented for this site.
What period of time would Mr. April have to formulate his response to be timely for the consideration by the city council of this item?
The city council does not have any meetings for the rest of this month. I don't know yet what the schedule is. I don't know how quickly this will be forwarded to the city council for review. The next scheduled city council meeting is September 3rd, and that's a Tuesday after the Labor Day holiday. So that would be the earliest.
So he'd have a couple of weeks.
So-
Okay, all those in favor of the motion?
Can I just say
Sure,
one last thing?
sure.
So this is my last gasp, dying man. Pick a scenario, Whole Foods shows up with a quaint little urban Whole Foods footprint, and they walk in with 60% open space, landscape buffers, single-family residential abutting the existing single-family residential, density that's far less than anything that we contemplate today in this plan, and a tax component that far exceeds anything that would be produced. We don't want to see it.
They could propose.
Well, I mean, who's going to? Right now, you've basically said this has got to be a primary residential.
Well, they submit a proposal, they get it considered.
But again, if I'm listening to my consultant, you know, he's telling me that we're spending this time doing this so that people aren't wasting their time coming up with concepts that will not get a fair shake.
Is that a question, Mr. Brown?
I don't know that people will take the time to propose something like that with
Well,
what we're drafting.
if, and I don't know whether there will be, if there's a 2-step process, it could, it could be considered at the first stage, kept in for the second stage. It could be screened out. One of 2 things could happen. Lee, are you itching to comment?
It ain't over till it's over. I think the reality is that any proposal is going to have to convince the city council that they can handle the traffic and the parking, and that it fits in the community, and that, particularly in the case of something off the anticipated mix of uses, would have to show such an extraordinary impact positively to the community that both PP&L and ultimately City Council will say, put aside the notion of a apples to apples competition on residential. This is a great opportunity for us, and they will take action because that will be a proven point at that point. So what I'm saying is, we're looking at a window, I think, that relates to when the RFQ goes out and when the RFPs ultimately go to a limited set of development interests. And if something is proposed between now and then that steers off this mix, then it will have a life of its own.
I think maybe Jeff is concerned that if the B2 is 3 acres, right, it would discourage, as structured, any proposal like he hypothetically put forward.
Well, I think he hit the point of the primarily residential is the fundamental point, because I'm not convinced that the underlying zoning as it is today will be the underlying zoning that it ultimately is adopted and approved as part of the plan. If it's in the best interest of the plan to adjust the boundaries of where that B2 is, or that a different underlying district as part of an overall unified development proposal, then you will be reviewing that. But the fundamental that we're trying to convey is, and I think that Commissioner Ziccarelli said it well, which is play within these boundaries and you have a higher probability of catching the interest of City Council that says you're the winning developer. The developers will read this and do professional tea leaf reading and determine whether or not they have the ability to convince you that theirs is the best overall design. Right now, I will admit to you that we have been speaking predominantly to residential developers. We have spoken to some commercial developers. To date, they have not been knocking on the door with a grocery store. There have been some developers who have shown interest at the potential for a small commercial-only building right at the corner. No one has yet, and this is just what we've heard, no one has said that the commercial mixed-use building, where you have residential above or office above or something like that, is currently a driving force in the market, in this market, in Lake Forest market.
In that location.
Okay. Thank you. Are you ready for the question? Okay, all those in favor of the recommendations as revised, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Motion carries unanimously. Okay,
Thank you very much.
thank you. Is there any public testimony on non-agenda items? That's the next item before us. Seeing none. Additional information from staff. Kathy?
I don't have anything.
Okay. Very good. We're well ahead of our mandatory adjournment time at 11 o'clock. Our next meeting is on September 24th.
Right.
I appreciate all of your flexibility on that date, speaking for myself. Okay, motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Moved and second. All those in favor of adjournment, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Motion carries.